A confrontation that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in 72 explosive hours. 72 hours that brought the Middle East to the edge of a wider war. 72 hours that forced Benjamin Netanyahu to activate protocols not seen since the darkest days of October 2023. 72 hours that compelled President Donald Trump to deploy one of the most formidable strike forces assembled in the region since the invasion of Iraq. What Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said this week crossed a line that American diplomats, Israeli strategists, and regional mediators had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, neither Washington nor Jerusalem hesitated. They responded with speed, with overwhelming force, and with a message that reverberated from Tehran to Damascus to every proxy stronghold in between. This is not a drill. This is not posturing. This is a crisis alert, and what happens in the coming days may determine the trajectory of the entire region for a generation. 4 months now, there had been signals, not official intelligence briefings, not formal diplomatic cables, just signals that Iran's new president was preparing something unprecedented. Masoud Pezeshkian has been cautious, yes, but he has been calculating in his caution. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a choreography that intelligence analysts in Langley and Tel Aviv had learned to read. But what set off alarm bells in the Pentagon and the Israeli Security Cabinet this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence officers who monitor Iranian military communications know the indicators. The movement of Revolutionary Guard commanders to forward positions, the unusual activation of ballistic missile units near the Iraq border, the sudden radio silence from Quds force operatives in Lebanon and Syria. The abrupt cancellation of scheduled diplomatic meetings, all of that went quiet. And whenever Tehran goes quiet, it means something is about to get very, very loud. Israeli intelligence had been tracking what they described internally as pre-escalation positioning, subtle shifts in Iranian military posture that suggested preparation for a significant operation. But no one expected Pezeshkian himself to step to the microphone. No one expected the threat that came next. Early Tuesday morning, Israeli military intelligence detected what they described as an unprecedented escalation in hostile rhetoric, including statements from President Pezeshkian that had not been made by any Iranian leader in over 2 decades. Speaking before a gathering of Revolutionary Guard commanders in Tehran, Pezeshkian delivered what analysts are now calling the most direct threat against Israel since Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's era. But unlike Ahmadinejad's bombastic declarations, Pezeshkian's words carried a chilling specificity. He spoke of erasing the Zionist entity's ability to strike Iran. He spoke of capabilities that the enemy has not yet witnessed. And most alarmingly, he spoke of the sacred duty to respond to Israeli aggression with weapons that will change the equation permanently. These are the kinds of statements that Iranian leaders only make when they are signaling something very specific: imminent military action, a fundamental shift in deterrence posture, or authorization for proxy forces to escalate without restraint. Israeli intelligence didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 at once. But what they did know was that Iran was changing its strategic posture. And when a nation with ballistic missiles, proxy armies across 4 countries, and an advancing nuclear program shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence service from Washington to Riyadh pays attention. Within hours, Netanyahu convened an emergency meeting of the Security Cabinet. Within hours after that, the phone lines between Jerusalem and Washington were burning. The response issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Administration official after National Security Council meeting described Pezeshkian's statements as provocative beyond acceptable norms, indicative of potential operational planning, and perhaps most importantly, time to test American resolve during a period of regional transition. Iranian strategists have long believed that creating uncertainty is their greatest weapon, that ambiguity forces their enemies to hesitate, that threats, properly calibrated, can achieve what missiles cannot. But strategic ambiguity only works if the target hesitates. Benjamin Netanyahu did not. Donald Trump did not. In fact, their response today was among the most rapid and comprehensive we've seen in the modern history of U.S.-Israel strategic coordination. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of Pezeshkian's speech being translated and analyzed, Netanyahu activated what Israeli media is calling full war mode, a comprehensive military readiness protocol that includes full mobilization of air defense systems across all sectors, deployment of additional Iron Dome batteries to northern communities, activation of Arrow, 3 anti-ballistic missile systems, preparation of long-range strike capabilities. These weren't the standard readiness adjustments Israel makes periodically. These were wartime preparations, systems and protocols that Israel only activates when they are preparing to either absorb a major attack or launch one. Tonight, multiple defense sources confirmed that President Trump ordered the immediate deployment of a carrier strike force to the eastern Mediterranean, including the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower and its full battle group that had recently been repositioned from the Red Sea for what the Pentagon initially described as routine operations. There was nothing routine about what happened next. Trump deployed before Iran could calculate its next move. He deployed air assets to bases in the Gulf region. He deployed additional missile defense systems to protect American personnel. He positioned submarine assets that were likely preparing to provide strike capability if needed. In other words, Trump targeted not just Iran's potential actions, but Iran's ability to act. The infrastructure that would have made any Iranian operation viable. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Pezeshkian's threat wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of declaration that could trigger a regional war if left unchecked. And Netanyahu, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. Israeli forces didn't strike Iranian territory directly. They didn't target civilian infrastructure. They hit Hezbollah weapons depots in southern Lebanon. They hit Iranian military advisors' positions in Syria. They struck supply routes that connected Tehran's forward forces to operational launch sites. In military terms, this is called shaping the battlefield. In practical terms, it means Israel was preparing for the worst while sending a message that the cost of Iranian aggression would be catastrophic. And here's where the story becomes even more alarming. Intelligence analysts now believe that Pezeshkian's threat was designed to test the cohesion of American-Israeli strategic alignment after months of regional uncertainty. Iran wanted to see whether Netanyahu would wait for American approval. Iran wanted to see whether Trump would restrain Israeli action. Iran wanted to probe whether the alliance had weakened. But instead, the opposite happened. Netanyahu didn't wait for permission. Trump didn't restrain, he reinforced. The coordination was so immediate, so comprehensive, that even Iranian state media noticed. You don't get Tehran's attention easily. They have weathered decades of sanctions, isolation, and military threats. But today, the speed and scale of the American-Israeli response clearly registered. Iranian military analysts speaking with regional media under anonymity described the Allied response as unexpectedly unified, a way to signal that attempts to divide Washington and Jerusalem had failed completely. But Netanyahu proved today that Israel remains both willing and capable of independent action. And Trump proved that American support is not merely rhetorical. Their actions were not only decisive, they were synchronized so precisely that the carrier strike force arrived in the eastern Mediterranean within 48 hours of Netanyahu's cabinet meeting. That timing matters because it shows prepositioned planning. It shows that Washington and Jerusalem have been preparing for exactly this scenario. It shows that Israel is not merely waiting for American leadership. They are operating as full strategic partners. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of the Allied response. The Israeli Air Force carried out over 40 strikes on Iranian-linked targets in Syria, forcing Russian air defense systems to track but not engage, a sign that Moscow is unwilling to directly confront Israeli operations. American F-35 squadrons were repositioned to bases in Jordan and the UAE that had been placed on heightened alert in the last 72 hours. British Royal Navy vessels operating in the Persian Gulf reportedly began monitoring Iranian naval movements that analysts believe were preparations for potential mining operations in the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia, though publicly silent, privately communicated to Washington that it would allow overflight rights if American aircraft needed rapid access to Iranian airspace. This wasn't just military posturing. This wasn't just diplomatic signaling. This was coalition assembly. This was the formation of a regional response architecture. And regional response architecture is the one thing Iran has struggled to prevent since the Abraham Accords fundamentally realigned Middle Eastern alliances. For every advance Iran has made through its proxy network, the American-Israeli Gulf Partnership has countered with something that complicates Tehran's calculations further. Today was the clearest demonstration, yet that this partnership is not merely theoretical. It is operational, it is ready, and it is watching. Remember, Iran thought the October 7th aftermath would fracture Israeli society permanently. They thought international pressure would force Netanyahu to accept terms favorable to Hamas. They thought the Biden administration's caution signaled American war weariness that would carry over regardless of who won the 2024 election. They thought Trump, focused on domestic priorities, would not risk military confrontation in the Middle East. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Israel is more militarily prepared than at any point since the 1973 Yom Kippur War. American force projection in the region is approaching levels not seen since the height of operations against ISIS. And the Gulf states, once reluctant to openly align with Israel, are now providing quiet but essential support. Everything Iran believed about allied weakness has been proven wrong. And Pezeshkian's gamble, his calculated threat designed to probe that weakness, has instead revealed allied strength in its starkest terms. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Pezeshkian's threat happened at a time when Netanyahu is under extraordinary domestic political pressure. His coalition partners want aggressive action against all threats. His military leaders want strategic patience and precise targeting. His intelligence services want to avoid triggering a wider war that could draw in Russia. His American allies want coordination and restraint. And the Israeli public wants security, whatever that requires. Netanyahu is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing the ongoing conflict in Gaza, the simmering tension with Hezbollah, and the persistent threat of Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Yemen. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. But vulnerability in a nuclear threshold state with one of the world's most capable militaries is not weakness. It is unpredictability. And unpredictability is what makes this crisis so volatile. The State Department's formal statement, now circulating through every diplomatic channel, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Iranian threats to go unanswered. Senior officials said plainly that Pezeshkian's declaration was inconsistent with the behavior of a responsible state. That is diplomatic language for, we consider this a potential act of war preparation. You don't usually hear that tone from Foggy Bottom unless something serious is at stake. The Pentagon's subsequent briefing was even more direct. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stated unequivocally that American forces stand ready to defend our allies and our interests against any Iranian aggression. He confirmed the deployment of additional assets, but declined to specify their exact composition, a standard practice when operational security is paramount. But what he did confirm was telling. He confirmed that President Trump had authorized all necessary preparations, language that, in Pentagon terms, means authorization for offensive action if required. Meanwhile, Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the Israeli Knesset in a somber, determined speech tonight. He said, "The enemies of Israel have made their intentions clear. We will make our response even clearer." He said, "No threat, no matter how loud, no matter how frequent, will deter us from defending our people." And he said, "To our allies in Washington and around the world, Israel does not ask permission to survive, but we are grateful for partners who understand what survival requires." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become, and they are statements designed to be heard in Tehran. Netanyahu's message was clear: escalation will be met with escalation. And if Iran believes that threats can achieve what diplomacy and warfare have not, they are catastrophically mistaken. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Pezeshkian's threat wasn't isolated. Along with his declaration in Tehran, Hezbollah's leadership in Beirut also issued statements warning of consequences for continued Israeli operations in Lebanon. Houthi forces in Yemen announced they would expand operations against shipping in the Red Sea. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq increased rocket attacks, targeting American personnel at bases near Baghdad. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Iran moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This is not coincidence. This is coordination. And coordination suggests that Tehran is either preparing for a significant operation or attempting to create enough chaos to force diplomatic concessions. Either way, the threat is real. Either way, the response must be serious. American and Israeli analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Pezeshkian is preparing a direct military strike against Israeli territory, perhaps using ballistic missiles that have been upgraded since the April 2024 attack. Another is that Iran is attempting to trigger a massive Hezbollah offensive in the north, using the Lebanese militia as a proxy to avoid direct confrontation with American forces. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Pezeshkian is attempting to create conditions for a nuclear breakout, using regional chaos as cover for the final steps toward a weapon. But today, Netanyahu and Trump took that card off the table. They didn't wait for the UN Security Council. They didn't wait for European mediation. They didn't wait for Iran to clarify its intentions. They deployed overwhelming force and made clear that any Iranian action would be met with devastating consequences. This is deterrence in its purest form, and deterrence only works if it is credible. Tonight, American and Israeli credibility is higher than it has been in years. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Iran wants to see whether it can threaten its way to regional dominance. Israel wants to show that threats will only accelerate its willingness to act. The United States wants to prevent a wider war while maintaining alliance credibility. And the Gulf states want to prevent Iranian hegemony without being drawn into direct conflict. These objectives are not perfectly aligned, but they are aligned enough that Iran faces a unified front it did not expect. The next 72 hours will determine whether Pezeshkian doubles down on his gamble or recognizes that the cost of escalation exceeds any possible benefit. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Iranian military communications around the clock. They say unusual activity continues at missile bases near Tabriz and Kermanshah. They say Revolutionary Guard naval forces have increased their presence in the Persian Gulf. And they say Pezeshkian's decision to issue such a direct threat is likely part of a broader strategy intended to establish new red lines before potential negotiations with Washington. But Netanyahu is not retreating. In fact, Israel is advancing its readiness further. Their response today, swift, comprehensive, and unambiguous, sent a message to Tehran that Israel will not be intimidated. And it sent a message to Washington that Israel is ready to act as a full partner in regional security. The carrier strike force is now in position. Israeli air defenses are at maximum readiness, and American satellites are tracking every movement on Iranian soil. As the crisis continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Pezeshkian hoped to achieve with his unprecedented threat. But what we do know is that the American-Israeli response was timely. It prevented Iran from establishing a narrative of allied hesitation. It demonstrated that military readiness is not merely defensive, and it reminded the world that some lines cannot be crossed without consequences. What happens next will depend on what Tehran does in the next 48 to 72 hours. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as a crisis that was contained. If they escalate, Washington and Jerusalem have already shown they are prepared for the worst. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown that the alliance is not merely words on paper. It is ships in the water, aircraft in the sky, and soldiers standing ready. And tonight, for the first time in decades, Iran appears to be reassessing. Tehran is quiet, too quiet. And when Iran is quiet after making such bold threats, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, the Islamic Republic learns something they have been forced to learn before, that threatening Israel carries costs, that America's commitment to its allies is not merely rhetorical, and that the window for consequence-free aggression has closed. This story is far from over. The crisis continues, the forces remain deployed, and the world watches. But tonight, one thing is clear: Benjamin Netanyahu will not back down. Donald Trump will not abandon an ally. And Iran's gamble has, so far, failed to achieve what it intended. And we will be here, watching every detail, tracking every development as the next phase of this crisis unfolds. Stay with us. The situation is developing, and what happens next may change everything.